The tractor rolled like a slow heartbeat across the unpaved road, its blue paint dulled by dust and the long push of harvest sun. Sugarcane stalks leaned in rows like an audience waiting for a small, private tragedy. Ana Clara sat at the wheel, 20 minutes from town, her books folded into the passenger seat, living proofs of a life she defended in the city, assignments, a law textbook dog-eared at criminal procedure, a letter from her faculty advisor tucked inside. Beside her, Helena tied a faded headscarf with habits the years had taught her, motion, murmur, a small, stubborn tenderness in the way she smoothed Ana Clara's sleeve. There was a rhythm to their silence, the quiet of two women moving through work and worry together. They counted the keystones of each other's days. Heat perched on the shoulders of the world. The tractor's metal smelled faintly of oil and cane. A bee landed on the rim of a coffee cup forgotten in the cab. It was the kind of day that dulled outrage and stretched patience thin. That's why when a patrol car pulled a slow wedge across the track and two uniforms stepped out like gatekeepers, the suddenness felt obscene, an intrusion that snapped the ordinary into jagged shapes. Sergeant Marias moved first, the short, heavy set of a man who'd learned to make authority felt. The two corporals with him, thin, eager, mirrored his posture, laughter held close to their mouths like a weapon. They carried themselves as if the road and its people owed them civility. Instead of a polite request, they offered a theater of power. "Documents," Marias said, not a question. His voice had the gravel of habit. His eyes had the calculation of one used to gain compliance before respect. Ana Clara reached for her license. Her fingers brushed the flap of a wallet, the corner of a photocopy she had made after a summer with long commutes. She moved slowly, respectful, nervous, a law student whose training had taught her to be precise, even in panic. One of the corporals stepped close, breath hot with the smell of sweat and cheap cologne. He flicked the paper, thumbed the name, smirked. "City girl," he said. The laugh that followed wasn't shared, it was pointed. The officer's fingers found the edge of the license and flattened it between calloused thumb and forefinger. He leaned over the seat as if to read intimately the life printed in ink. The tractor's engine idled. The field watched in the silence between insect calls. There was a movement, so small it might have been lost, a thumb marking a line, a breath held, and then the paper tore. It made a dry, final sound against the dirt. Ana Clara's hands shot forward before her thought could catch up, instinct reaching to reclaim what was being taken from her. Her fingertips grazed the torn edge. She wanted to gather the pieces like a child's paper airplane, to paste her identity back together, but the corporal's hand closed and the paper skimmed through his fingers. Humiliation arrived with the speed of a slop. The corporal's palm struck Ana Clara's cheek once, a crack that echoed against the metal. Her head snapped aside. The tractor's cab filled with the taste of dust and copper, the moment stretching into a film of small, sharp things, a book sliding, a coffee cup jittering, Elena's hand landing on Ana Clara's shoulder. For a heartbeat, she felt the face numb under a heat that wasn't the sun. The world shirled between the bright and the obscene. "Out," Marias ordered. The word was a sentence. He spoke as though law and mercy were the same coin he could flip. Elena moved first, the choreography of a woman who had learned compliance across decades. Hands visible, keys on the hook, headscarf held tight. She walked with the steady step of someone who had been cuffed not by iron but by custom. Never enough money, never enough protection, yet proud enough to keep her face steady. They were marched to the patrol car like animals taught their route. Marias barked accusations that had nothing to do with the torn paper. Suspicion folded into insult, a litany of petty slights turned into justification. The corporals, Mendez and Tavares, repeated them as if they were hymns. They cuffed Elena's wrists with practiced speed. Ana Clara's hands were steadier than she felt. She tried to speak, to call the facts back into order, but her words were swallowed by the officer's laughter. Inside the small town station, the fluorescent lights spat a hard and different glare. Walls were painted in a bureaucratic blue that dulled details and sharpened shadows. A cell in the back smelled of bleach, damp concrete, a rusted hinge. That claustrophobic scent is old and known to places that keep people until they are ready to let them go. The metal bench scraped as they were pushed through. Elena's breath hitched in a way that sounded formless, like a small animal trapped behind glass. Ana Clara felt the room spin on a tilt axis, law textbooks reduced to metaphor. She had studied custody law in airy lecture halls, cross-examined hypothetical witnesses in safe rooms. Nothing in those casebooks taught her the taste of institutional laughter. One of the corporals made a joke about city girls thinking they were better. Marias tilted his head, the motion practiced. They left the cell door open like an exit sign that wasn't meant to be used. The cell was small enough that being in it felt like an intimacy. The light overhead buzzed. Helena sat down in a slow, tired motion, placed a cracked hand over the inside of her elbow where she felt the wheeze first. Her breath rattled like a gate struggling to open. She coughed, a sound that gathered in the hollows like an accusation. She began, then halted, half smile and half begging. Ana Clara moved closer, pressed her shoulder against her mother's back, breathed in the scent of liniment and laundry, and tasted fear as sharp as lemon.
"Don't worry," Ana Clara said, louder than she intended. Words were anchors. She repeated laws, procedural artifacts of the life she wanted. Right to call a lawyer, right to medical attention. An officer leaned at the door, a cigarette between fingers like an accessory. He laughed, said the station had no ambulance service on call, that Helena could wait. Helena's chest tightened again. Each breath was a small theft. Her lungs wanted to play a different rhythm. At first it was a cough, then labored exhales. Her oxygen-starved eyes searched the room, first for the uniform, then for her daughter. "They won't," she said. Another cough clanged out like a bell. Time narrowed. The absence of urgency amplified sound until it became a thing itself. The squeak of boots, the hum of lights, a key turned in a distant lock. The corporals moved through their routine with the speed of men who had memorized ennui and turned it into authority. Ana Clara's pleas slid off their skin like rain off wax. In the cell, the world bent into a small cone of light. The rest was gray. Helena's breathing hitched and then fluttered. She began to clutch at her throat as if trying to pull air in by will. Her eyes rolled briefly toward the ceiling and her lips repeated a name, Ana Clara, like a prayer, like a claim. The cough took on the persistence of a thing determined to break us. Finally, she gasped and her shoulders heaved in a way that made Ana Clara stand up with a violent jerk. "She's asthmatic," Ana Clara shouted, the words a sudden blade. They slashed the station air into new pieces. Someone looked, delayed, then looked away. Another laughed, adjusting an ankle. "Please," she said, the plead now a professional duty. "Call the ambulance, let the medic in, hand over an oxygen canister, something that would gather proof and mercy in the same motion." A corporal shrugged, as if shrugging were a legal defense. Marias walked out of earshot like a man unwilling to stain his boots. The telephone across the desk rang and lay unanswered. The clerk had his back turned to them, fingers on a file. The clock on the wall continued to move, indifferent. Ana Clara's mouth tasted like iron and salt. Fear had no grammar. Her hands were steady enough to clutch evidence, a torn license, a smear of dirt on an officer's cuff, small facts that in a different life would be seized and catalogued. Here, the facts were slow to matter. In a private part of the station, Theo, the clerk, a man with a small, nervous laugh, fed the receiver to a bored ear. He would later say he thought the emergency was a drama to be contained. For now, he delayed. For now, a woman's breath spelled out an accusation that required no words. Outside, the night came in predictable. The dust cooled, the temperature dropped a degree. Nearby houses threw little pools of lamplight that didn't reach the station's peeling steps. A single patrol car idled near the gate, radio humming.
In the bright wash of the station's fluorescent white, the small-town mechanisms churned on. Back in the city, a phone on a table vibrated and went unanswered. Detective Isabella Fontes had been fielding a shift of calls that felt like a stack of small fires. A report from an informant about a stolen motorbike, a traffic collision with a minor injury, a summons for paperwork on a case that had stalled. She let the phone keep a pattern of missed vibrations. It is a cruel work to insist that every ring demands rescue. The second call from an unknown number flashed across the screen before she could get to it. She took in the name on the frame, Ana Clara Fontes, and then sat for a breath that tasted like a line break. Isabella's apartment was a tidy friction of work and life. Case files stocked like kindling, a framed photo of their mother Helena with hair pulled back and the three of them in a dusty field, smiles softer than the world allowed, and a mug with a slogan about justice that had once been an inside joke. She thought of the mug now as she dialed. Her voice was a narrow wire of control when the call went to voicemail. She tried once more. Minutes drew toward each other like magnets. The city sounds were muffled beyond her windows, traffic murmurs, the distant laughter of people whose problems were far from being named.
The second voicemail was a clipped message. Isabella, this is Lucas. You should call. There's trouble out on the back road. Lucas. Even the name arrived with texture. The boy whose father owned the Mercer store by the bridge. The one who traded small kindnesses for cigarettes at the station. The one who had eyes for the world that never held a judge's gavel. Isabella had used him before. His loyalty came cheap, but his witness was reliable. Her thumb trembled over the screen. A dozen procedural options unfurled. File an occurrence, call the duty officer, open a request to the local station. The jurisdictional line between her, detective in the capital, and the small-town precinct was precise. She could ask for a transfer, she could call and make sure the chain of custody was preserved, she could use her badge to demand documentation. But often, jurisdiction was a polite barrier for those who wanted to let small wrongs lie where they fell. Isabella did not have the luxury of politeness. She grabbed her coat, sling a shoulder holster over the fabric like a second skin. In her bag, a small camera, a notepad, the legal pads that had been a part of every long investigation. Alves and Ricardo, two investigators who had earned more than a few favors on the city force, were her usual companions for showing force that was legal and visible. She texted them both a short instruction. Meet me at the gate. Lucas called in trouble on Route 14. Possible abuse. We go by the book. Within an hour, Isabella was on the highway, the city light leaking away behind her, replaced by a smeared ribbon of darkness in fields.
The drive toned her like a quieting drum. She let her mind populate the coming moments with lists. What she needed: witness statements, photos of the vehicle and torn documents, a clear chain of custody, medical attention for Helena, statements from the buyer of the station's logbook. She rehearsed her lines. I am exercising authority to inspect. I am requesting immediate medical care. I will secure evidence. She kept the rhetoric clean, because law is mercy when rendered with precision, and she had been taught to turn outrage into protocol. When she arrived at the town, the station's porch light cut a small halo into the night, like a halo of insufficient grace. Alves waited in the squad car, a man who moved with the slow certainty of someone who had seen too many things and filed them away. Ricardo stood a step back from the door, arms folded, the habit of a man who liked to watch before he acted. Lucas was there, his young face thinner than in memory. He had troubles that worked like fossil layers. His jaw clenched as he saw Isabella. He didn't need to say much. His eyes handed her a story like a signed affidavit. She's in there, Lucas said. The mother, Helena, she's having trouble breathing. They won't let an ambulance in. The station smelled of scent cigarettes and dull paper. Someone from the station let them in with a curt nod, as if the presence of a detective from the capital's force was a minor hazard to endure. Inside, the lighting was the same merciless white. The clerk's face flipped between professional fatigue and nervous excitement. News traveled fast here. Scandal was the station's currency. Isabella walked through like someone who knows the floor plan of human failing. She could read a scene by the arrangement of objects. The patrol car logs were open on a table. They had been recorded but not yet fully filed. A quick inspection revealed carelessness, gaps in entries, shorthand that suggested an intent to obscure. Someone had already stamped the station's insignia and not completed procedure for detainee intake. She asked for the cell number. The clerk pointed with a jittering hand. The door to the holding area had a small slot in it like a mouth that opened and closed for information. Through the metal grate, she saw a single silhouette, two, then three, seated on a bench with bodies folded like accordion pleats. For a second, the room read like a still life. Then a sound came that was thin and high, a wheeze. It sliced the room clean. Isabella's hand went to the door. The sound had a geometry that arrested motion, fragile, a little like a violin string too taut. She wasn't blind to the legalities. She could not simply fling doors open. Authority has shape. But the law also demands care when a life hangs in the balance. She checked the intake chart, verified the custody record, and noted the absence of a medical request. Her pen drove lines across the page like a surgeon's scalpels. Name, time of arrest, statements omitted, EMS not called. Who's responsible here? She asked, voice even. It was the tone that had carried her through interrogations, through the bureaucratic storms that left careers frayed. The clerk stammered, offered a name. Isabella wrote it down. She spoke into the air that a medical report would be filled, that oxygen was to be given, that a physician was to be contacted now. She heard the phone on the desk vibrate. Someone answered with a slow, professional cadence. But as she moved to the cell door, her hand paused in the space between the iron and her palm. She listened to Helena's breath, then to the static on the phone, the murky delay that made callers sound distant as if underwater. A thought slipped into Isabella's jaw like a splinter. In a small town, delay is a tool. People use rhythm to justify neglect. She turned to the clerk. "Call EMS again," she said, "and copy me on that dispatch." She added a demand she didn't like to make. "Log every auction you take. I'm documenting now." The clutch of the situation tightened. Her badge at her neck felt like a coin of obligation. She made a list in her head: photographs, torn documents, names of witnesses, the intake sheet that would later be evidence, the torn driver's license retrieved from the ground, the smear of mud on the officer's cuff, Lucas's statement that he had seen the corporal rip the document in front of Ana Clara, Helena's oxygen-deprived collapse in an unresponsive cell. Isabella thought of the little rituals that define a case: bagging paper, signing chain of custody forms, asking the clerk to note the time down to the minute. Those small rituals were a way to hold reality to the standard of the law. They are what make accusations not mere noise, but objects that can be placed on a table and examined under harsh light. She called Alves and Ricardo in a low voice and outlined what she needed them to do: secure the perimeter, photograph the tractor and the torn papers found near the road, take statements from nearby witnesses, and corroborate the timeline. She instructed Lucas to write out what he had seen in his own words, then signed it in front of her. She had him mark the time and sign with his full name. He wiped his palms on his jeans and did it. As the team moved into motion, Isabella opened the cell's metal door. The sound of the latch traveling was a small, solemn ritual. The space inhaled as the air shifted. For a moment, everything contracted to the small act of one woman reaching into another's suffering. Helena's face was gray in an exposure that made both her beauty and her frailty grotesquely visible. Her chest rose and fell in a pattern that refused oxygen's rhythm, a jagged, desperate punctuation. Her fingers, with nail ridges of years that had tended a home and kept food on a table, were caught at her throat. Her eyes, when they focused, found Isabella's with a recognition stripped of surprise. "Isabella," she whispered. The name arrived like a rope thrown into a dark pool. Isabella steadied herself. The station's hum seemed suddenly obscene. She checked Helena, noting cyanosis at the lips, the rate of breath, the way air sounded like a stolen thing. She barked orders with the crispness of someone who knew a life could be held by the momentum of a decision. "Get the oxygen tank, now. Somebody call a supervisor. Document who refused the medical call." A corporal moved, sluggishly at first, then with reflex when he met her eye. An oxygen tank was dragged into the cell like a rescue ballet. A mask was fitted to Helena's face, plastic cold and foreign. The sound of air entering her chest again had the effect of a small miracle, but Isabella knew better than to call it such. It was clinical intervention. It was evidence of neglect met by the tools of care. Helena's breathing eased, a fraction. Her hand fumbled for Ana Clara's and closed like a claim. For a breathing instant, the cell felt like a borrowed space where mercy had been reintroduced by procedure. Isabella stepped back and took in the room. The list waiting on her pod grew heavier: negligence, assault, abuse of authority. Her pen moved with the habit of someone cataloging truth one fact at a time. The torn license bagged in a clear evidence envelope. Photos taken, close shots of the tear, the officer's hands, the bruise on Ana Clara's cheek. Statements recorded and sworn. Yet even as she worked, there was a noise at the edge of her awareness. A phone vibrating on the clerk's counter, an incoming call she watched like a storm cloud. She stepped aside and answered it, not looking at the display. The voice on the other end was the low, cultivated register of someone who keeps an institution's secrets. "Detective Fontes," the man said. There was a name behind it, Colonel Antunes, and it made the air cooler. "We are aware of the situation in your jurisdiction," he said. The tone folded years of command into the call. "We prefer this handled locally to avoid unnecessary spectacle." The sentence was a velvet glove over a fist. It did not contain an order so much as a pressure that would give consequences to anyone who ignored its shape. Isabella listened. She could hear through the colonel's phrasing a practiced maneuver, the attempt to reduce the matter to a quiet thing. She made a decision, immediate but measured. "Colonel," she said, "there is an injured person. Medical attention is being provided. Evidence is being secured. If you have a position to state, state it in writing. Right now, the priority is this woman's life." There was a pause long enough to be personal. "Keep me informed," he said finally, and the line clicked dead. The presence of the colonel's voice was a reminder of the institutional geometry she would be navigating, lines of power that could shift casework into political pressure. For now, Isabella's focus rested on the facts: Helena's recovery, Ana Clara's statement, a torn document now sealed in an evidence bag.
but the colonel's call sat like a small, dark shape on the edge of the night. Isabella stepped outside the station into the field air that smelled of cane and something colder, anticipation. She pulled 2 cigarettes from a pack, stuffing the second back into the box as if she were keeping time with herself. She rarely smoked, but the motion grounded her. Alvis approached with a folder. "Photos, detective," he said. "We have Lucas's signed statement and a half-dozen eyewitness notes from neighbors. The torn license was recovered near the wheel. Tractor owner confirms they were stopped about 40 minutes ago." Isabella ran her fingers along the edge of the photographs, each one a small testimony. The torn paper on the ground, the tractor's paint flaked with dust, the bruise on Ana Clara's cheek, the interior of the cell with its single bulb. The evidentiary chain was forming like a map. She turned, eyes narrowing with a considered hardening. "We do this by the book," she said, more to herself than to Alvis. "Chain of custody, witness statements, medical report. I will command the scene in 10 minutes. Any interference and I document it." Alvis nodded. "What about Marias and his corporals?" he asked. Isabella held the photographs up like a mirror. "We will proceed according to statute. We have witnesses, we have an injured detainee, we have contradictions in their intake log. If they resist, we proceed with an arrest in flagrante delicto where jurisdiction allows." As she spoke, her wrist vibrated again, an unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. A sense of pressure settled over the station like a low cloud. The field beyond it made no promises. Inside, a woman on a bench breathed with a rescued regularity. Outside, the world prepared to assert its structures. Something like an imbalance had been introduced, and the smallest of acts, an officer tearing a paper, a call to an ambulance delayed, was beginning to orient larger forces. Isabella pushed her coat tighter and looked at the station's front door as if it were an invitation and a challenge at the same time. She thought of the photograph over her desk, Helena and her daughters in a different summer, and she let the thought push her like an oar. "Let's move," she said. "We document everything, we preserve the scene, no improvising." At the threshold, she paused. The light in the sky had gone to the color of old coins. Somewhere down the road, a lights in the distance cluster suggested a patrol returning, or perhaps the approach of something more deliberate. When she reached for the cell door handle again, the thin wheeze threaded through the metal as if to remind her of the urgency that outmatched procedure. Her hand closed on the cool metal knob. The hinge hummed. She felt the weight of the town, of her sisters, of a life measured in small acts of courage, and the large machinery that could attempt to erase them. The line between doing what is right and what is safe narrowed to an instant in which a detective decided how far she would go. Inside, Helena's eyes opened to the light of the station bulb. She fixed on Isabella and whispered her name like an accusation and a blessing. The sound reached Isabella and collected there, somewhere like a charge. Isabella stepped into the cell, pen poised. The door swung behind her. The rest of the world rearranged itself outside the metal teeth, and a low, furious clarity took her by the shoulder. If you believe ordinary people standing up to power can change the course of a life, stay with this story. Isabella stepped fully into the cell as if the air itself had a temperature. Helena's skin was the color of worn paper. Her lips were a thin, pale map. Isabella's first movement was purely professional. She checked for pulse, noted respiratory rate, looked for cyanosis, and reached for the oxygen valve herself when the corporal nearest the doorway hesitated. The mask's plastic fit over Helena's nose and mouth, a clinical interface between neglect and care. Helena sucked air in like a person who had been given permission to keep existing. "Record the time," Isabella said, her voice smooth with command. "Who refused the emergency call?" Theo, the clerk, found his voice lost between guilt and a sudden small fear. I thought they'd handle it," he said. "Mariah said it wasn't necessary." "Write that down," Isabella ordered. "Write his words, sign with your name. If you refuse, sign that too." The officers in the room shifted like prey around a sentinel. Mariah's walks through a framed doorway, his jaw a hard line. The two corporals, Mendez and Tavares, avoided Isabella's eyes. They had been part of their own theater, and now the stage had been interrupted. Isabella moved with a practiced economy. She dictated photographs to be taken from multiple angles, Helena's face with the oxygen mask in place. The bruise on Ana Clara's cheek had a precise distance for scale, the torn edge of the license photographed next to a ruler, the tractor's skid mark at the roadside. She instructed Alves and Ricardo to seal evidence immediately, clear plastic bags, sign chain of custody seals, tamper-evident tape. Each time she spoke, things that had been meant to disappear gathered format and name. "I'm issuing a notice of immediate custody for all people involved in the intake," she said quietly, watching for the effect. "They will remain where they are until the district control arrives. Nobody leaves the premises without my written order." Marias bristled. "You can't. This is our jurisdiction," he said, voice a flat instrument of command that expected allegiance. "You can file," Isabella replied.
I'll make sure the district controls sees the intake log and the recording of Helena's respiration. Right now, your obligation is to preserve medical care and evidence. Anything contrary will be noted." She stepped out to the station office and ordered the clerk to replay the security camera files. The station's aged CCTV system spat out 3 grainy clips: a patrol car pulling near the tractor, the officers approaching, the moment a paper is taken and then torn. The angle was not cinematic, it was functional, forensic. Isabella froze a frame where the corporal's hand was crumpling the license and then instructed Alves to make a copy, timestamp it, and include it in the chain of custody bag. Lucas's signed note was photographed next to his ID. The narrative of the night was being braided into proof. Moraes tried to make the case that force had been necessary because the driver had been uncooperative. Mendez and Tavares echoed him, voices smaller in the face of recorded evidence. Isabella did not raise her voice. She methodically read the intake chart against the CCTV and the field report she had her people take at the tractor. The contradictions were plain. Times did not line up, the detainees' entry signatures were missing, and there was no medical request before Helena began to show signs of respiratory distress. "You are under arrest," Isabella said at last, simple and final. "Sergeant Larise, Corporal Mendez, Corporal Tavares, you're being detained for assault, abuse of authority, and false imprisonment, pending transfer to district custody. I am making the arrest in flagrante, based on the evidence presented here." In the moment before his cuffs closed, Moraes tried to summon the language of rank. "Detective, you don't understand. This is our station." "You assaulted a citizen who posed no threat," Isabella interrupted. "You obstructed medical care. You have signatures and camera footage that contradict your intake. You will be processed." The handcuffs clicked on Moraes' wrists with a sound Isabella had learned to listen for. It was not the satisfying snap found in cinema. It was a sober instrument of law. When she read the detainees their rights, she did so with a legal cadence that left room for no improvisation. Alves and Ricardo documented every movement, a choreography of legality to guard the case against narratives that would be made later. Word of the arrests spread faster than Isabella expected. The town had narrow streets and a small, nervous population who measured scandal like rain. A woman from the bakery came in to ask if it was true her husband had seen the patrol stop the tractor. A neighbor who had been on his porch offered a sworn statement about hearing a slap. Lucas's father, who owned the Mercer, pressed his palm into Isabella's hand in an old gesture that was more than thanks. "You didn't forget us," he said. Isabella filed the reports with the district, transmitted the photographs, and requested immediate transfer of the 3 suspects to the county lockup. The paperwork moved like a living thing under her pen. Then, the phone on the desk, her phone, vibrated again. This time, the incoming number was not unknown. "Detective Fontes," said a voice with the dry rasp of someone who has built a career on pressure rather than persuasion. "This is Colonel Antunes. I was informed. Handle with care." Isabella kept speaking into the line while the colonel's sentences arranged like preformed objections. "We prefer these matters not to become a spectacle. Keep all parties in place until headquarters conducts a thorough review." "Colonel," she said, her tone respectful but unyielding, "we have an injured detainee. The law requires medical care and the preservation of evidence. At this moment, there are multiple witnesses in CCTV that suggests misconduct. The appropriate action is to transfer the suspects out of this facility and submit the evidence to district custody. I am copying everything to you." There was a thin pause. "Very well," Antunes said finally. "Inform me of your next steps. We will review the file." The line went dead. The politeness had the weight of a promise to watch. For the colonel, watching could mean intervening. For Isabella, that could mean new obstacles. She had expected pressure. She had not expected the speed with which it would arrive. Within an hour, unmarked vehicles began to line the road in configurations that suggested containment. By late night, the station's mailbox and the patch of pavement outside had clustered with patrol wagons and at least 2 armored SUVs with henchmen who wore the tight, corporate indifference of institutional muscle. The sight of them altered the geometry of the little town, turning the porch light into an island in a sea of uniformed intent. Antunes' escalation was both show and message. He dispatched orders to have a contingent formed nearby to, quote, "secure the perimeter," under the pretense of protecting local assets. Those words had chosen meaning: protect the station from outside interference, ensure order. But in practice, they could be applied to keeping a detective from removing officers or evidence. The first 2 vans idled with engines humming like large animals. Officers on the tarmac stood like sentinels with hands folded around the night. Isabella watched them from the window of the station office, counting the vehicles and the badge numbers that were visible in the half-light. Alvis and Ricardo moved with equal parts caution and irritation. "We can get blocked in here," Ricardo murmured. "If they try to interfere—" "We document everything," Isabella said. "We keep the evidence sealed and we call my supervisor. I'm informing district control that you are physically present in numbers that may intimidate witnesses." Outside, one of the corporals who had been part of the original crew, now in custody, was taken up the steps in a plain, pragmatic transfer from station custody to district van. The stillness of the shift felt like a brief reconciliation with the process. Then the phone rang again. This time it was not from Antunes. It was a different sound, faster, made of transmission rather than command. Isabella recognized the name as someone who worked a different network, a journalist from the regional news station who sounded like someone who'd been given a line and found it curious. Antunes had already contacted a friendly reporter, a move that had the faint smell of theatrical management. "Is this Detective Fontes?" the reporter asked. "We have been told to come by a source at headquarters. There are pictures. Anything we should know?" Isabella made a quick decision. She could not rely on the colonel to manage narrative fairly. She could also not allow the station to be its own chamber of failing logic. She turned the choice into a public tool. "If you're coming, come in the next 5 minutes. We have an injured detainee who is denied care. We have recordings and witnesses," she said. "If you publish, you will be seeing the intake log, the CCTV, and a medical statement. If you're late, you will be reporting hearsay." It was an invitation that would later be called a gambit. It was also simply an act of converting light into protection. When the world watches, institutions are more likely to answer. The reporter arrived with a cameraman and an on-screen placard that made the little station look suddenly much larger. Lights and a lens tilted the station's worn paint into an other shape. Cameras reduce nuance, but they insist on frames that can be opened into quartz. Isabella allowed the journalist to record Helena's stabilized breathing, to photograph the torn license sealed in evidence, to take a statement from Lucas in a way that a controlled microphone made indelible. Antunes saw the pattern as well. Within an hour, the station was no longer a place that only knew the small town's gossip. It was the focus of live transmission. A column of vans in the mounted cameras painted a tableau that made the colonel's options thinner. He bolstered his presence with political posture. He called in more units under the argument of public order. The units came. The road near the station became a wall. That is when Isabella did the thing that would be quoted by the press later. She turned to the camera and spoke. "This is not about conflict between forces," she said, voice calm but edged with iron. "This is a question of whether those who are sworn to protect citizens will be held accountable when they are the ones who harm them. We have a woman in our custody who is denied medical aid. We have a law student who was assaulted and had her documents torn. We have CCTV and witnesses. We will not let procedure be used to shelter abuse." Her words landed with a gravity she felt in the places lawyers understood. They formed a public record. Antunes' people, who had expected to keep the matter private, found their options shrinking on a live screen. The segment ran. Tweets followed. Local talk shows called. A news cycle gathered like a storm. The presence of cameras changed more than perception. It changed institutional calculus. District headquarters could no longer treat the matter as a local inconvenience. The state's oversight body, Corregidoria, began to receive calls and an escalated pocket of evidence from Isabella herself. The governor's office, sensitive to optics and elections, sent a liaison with a note that things must be investigated immediately. The pressure built from lateral places, city prosecutors, a lawyer for Helena called by a neighbor, and citizen outrage expressed in small, angry bursts across social media. Institutions that had been comfortable operating in shadows now felt the light. In the meantime, inside the station, legal process continued where it was needed most. The 3 officers were readied for transfer. Their transfer forms were signed, witness attestations added. The transport to the county lockup was completed without physical altercation, but under the watchful presence of many eyes. Isabella made sure to have the chains of custody documented at every handoff. Who handled the evidence, timestamps, names, badge numbers. When the suspects were loaded into the van, the sound of closing doors and the ratcheting bars felt like a ritual. It did not erase the harm, but it made the harm accountable. Helena was taken by ambulance to the regional hospital where a pulmonology team triaged her condition, acute exacerbation of chronic asthma complicated by delayed treatment and possible hypoxia. The report read clinical and cold, acute on chronic respiratory failure, stabilized with nebulized bronchodilators, oxygen therapy, and monitoring. No irreversible anoxic damage observed. It was a relief in language. It was also an evidence point. The medical records would testify to neglect and refused aid.
At the hospital, Isabella sat in a chair too small for a woman who had carried a family's burden. She watched Helena sleep, saw the slow color returning to cheeks with the tide of a reclaimed shore. Ana Clara hovered near the bed, both brittle and held together by something that would later solidify into purpose. There were no cinematic speeches in that room, just small gestures, a mother's fingers testing her daughter's hair, a daughter smoothing a blanket like a ritual of repair. Ana Clara's arc shifted inside the hospital's fluorescent hush. In the days that followed, she gave a recorded statement while a victim advocate sat in the room and explained the process. The words were at first raw, describing humiliation, the sting of a slap, the forced march to her cruiser, but as she rehearsed the hours and the evidence became more visible, her tone changed.
She named the officers, described the tearing of the license, and recounted the delay of medical care with the clarity of someone teaching the court to see what she had seen. There was a moment she surprised herself by translating rage into law. She asked about the statutes, asked whether assault and abuse of power carried weight, and then asked what she could do as a young law student to contribute to the record of truth. It was a transmutation, victimhood into agency. As cameras continued to point at the station and public pressure mounted, the state's Corregidoria made a formal request for all files and demanded the temporary removal of Antunes from active command pending investigation. It was a rare political step that carried the tremor of consequence. Antunes, who had expected to apply pressure and then manage a quiet reorganization, found his position under unprecedented scrutiny. He posted defensive statements that read as institutional propriety, but sounded like a man trimming branches he feared might fall on him. The 3 detained officers were charged with assault, abuse of authority, and false imprisonment. The prosecutor added charges for neglect in a way that reflected medical testimony, contributory omission in denying requested medical care, a legal framing that tethered omission to culpability. The county judge, sensitive to the media atmosphere and the clarity of the evidence, ordered them held pending trial. The case file was thick with photographs, witness affidavits, medical reports, and the station's logs that Isabella had insisted be preserved. Yet, the legal campaign did not end with a single decision. Antunes had resources and networks. He used them to call meetings in closed rooms where sentences were shaped, calling for internal inquiries to question procedural compliance by Isabella herself. There were whispers that she had overreached jurisdictionally, that she had humiliated local officers, that her public statements risked institutional cohesion. For Isabella, these were the cost lines of choosing a visible fight. The very legal mechanisms she had used for accountability were used in counteraccusation. Her superiors called, and the tone varied between cautious support and clinical distance. Some praised her for doing what had to be done. Others urged restraint, worrying about career ripples in a public storm. She endured inquiries into minor technicalities, whether the proper chain of command was observed in detaining local officers, whether all forms had been filed in time, whether the presence of media had been invited in a way that compromised procedural neutrality. Isabella answered each with documentation, timestamps, and a methodical patience that matched her legal training. She did not conflate legitimacy with popularity. The law was a tool she used the same way others used authority, to achieve a result. The prosecution of Marias, Mendez, and Tavares moved forward with surprising speed for a rural jurisdiction. The cameras and the social pressure created a corridor that accelerated administrative steps. Formal indictments were returned faster than routine, and the trial calendar opened. Evidence was presented in a sequence that left little to the imagination. CCTV footage of the initial stop, photos of bruises and torn documents, sworn statements from Lucas and several neighbors, the hospital's record. The defense attempted to reframe moments, suggesting a misunderstanding, claiming the detainees were resisting, questioning witness credibility, but cross-examination revealed inconsistencies. In the courtroom, Ana Clara sat quietly alongside Helena and Isabella, the law textbooks in her lap now a different kind of armature. She listened and later offered testimony with a steadiness that surprised even herself. The legal outcomes were not neat. 2 of the 3 defendants received convictions for assault and abuse of authority. The third's case was complicated by procedural irregularities and resulted in a plea bargain that included suspension and community service. The court ordered administrative sanctions beyond criminal penalties. Marias was dismissed from the force, his reputation publicly shredded. Mendez and Tavares faced demotions and removal from active duty, their careers altered irrevocably. Antunes, who had not been charged criminally, received an administrative reprimand and was placed under investigation for mishandling and for attempting to exert undue influence.
The Corregidoria's report cataloged failures in oversight and the dangers of protecting institutional silence. It recommended reforms that were realistic enough to be possible and incomplete enough to reflect the stubborn persistence of institutional inertia. Those outcomes were meaningful but partial. Isabella's path through the months that followed was not a film of tidy triumph. She was called to hearings about jurisdictional propriety and faced colleagues who regarded her with a mix of admiration and wariness. Some of her promotions were quietly stalled, some friendships cooled under the pressure of choosing sides. Yet the public record had been established, the photographs, the signed statements, the medical report, so the core truth endured. She had acted within the law, using the law to expose a wrong. Helena's recovery was careful and gradual. She returned home with a plan for maintenance medication, inhalers, and instructions to avoid certain triggers. The medical team emphasized follow-up care. She regained weight, color, and with it, laughter that had been stilled by the night in the cell. There was no miracle. There was medicine, oxygen, time, and a steady hands-on of the family. She watched Ana Clara with a quiet pride that bordered on tenderness and relief.
"You didn't let them erase it," she told her daughter once, fingers brushing a fresh bruise that had faded into memory. Ana Clara, in turn, moved through a difficult terrain, part victim, part advocate. She enrolled herself in the Register of Witnesses in a way that made her studies feel less like theory and more like a tool for grounding justice. Isabella's professional life shifted in subtler ways. She was offered the option to transfer to a desk assignment while internal reviews occurred, an offer that signaled both protection and constraint. She refused the consolation of invisibility. She accepted the hearings but insisted on transparency. Her boss, aware of both political tides and her reputation for diligence, supported her publicly in statements and quietly in directives that kept her operational. She kept doing what she believed the badge required, taking cases, pressing for evidence, guarding the chain of custody. The town, too, became a different place after the case. People who had once accepted the authority of uniforms without question found it easier to ask for receipts, to insist on reports, to record encounters on their phones, to speak with more confidence to clerks and officers. The Mercer store near the bridge thrummed a bit more with conversation. Lucas's father refused to sell credit to certain officers for a while. It was not a revolution. It was an accumulation of small acts that shifted the measure of what might be tolerated. Publicly, the story functioned as a test of accountability. The media cycles that had turned the station's porchlight into a spotlight also auditioned for their own role as watchdogs. A handful of journalists produced follow-ups that kept the case in public attention for weeks. Columnists debated institutional culture. A few local politicians used the case to campaign for oversight reforms. Some changes were proposed and funded, others stalled. The system still contained protections for itself, but the cost of silence had been made higher. Isabella visited the school where Ana Clara would return to resume her studies. The sight of the young woman among her books, now resolved to pursue legal advocacy alongside her coursework, tugged at Isabella the way family does, not as a burden but as a responsibility honored. Ana Clara told her sister quietly that she intended to specialize in administrative law. "I want to make sure hospitals and stations can't ignore people like Mom," she said. "I want to learn the ways they hide things." "Then use your books like weapons," Isabella replied, half-smile softening her features. "And remember the rules. We win when we win them by their own measures." There were scenes of quiet reconciliation, Helena knitting while the radio reported an update on administrative changes from Brasilia, Ana Clara and a friend studying by lamplight, Lucas sweeping the Mercer floor with a new upright attention to what his choices meant. There were also the small costs. Isabella received fewer invitations to collegial dinners. A few veterans in the force avoided her. An old friend in the Capitol office kept distance as if proximity might stain their file. She counted those losses as part of the ledger. The badge on her chest sometimes weighed heavy in a way medals never do. In the months after, the Corregidora issued its full report. It listed failures and recommended disciplinary measures. Antunes faced an administrative trial that humiliated more than it legally ruined him. His name carried the tarnish of defended silence. The three officers had their careers scarred. The legal system had shown that public pressure and documented evidence could accelerate accountability. It was not a cure-all. There were other places where similar abuses went unremarked. But in this small town, a line had been drawn. The trial scenes were quiet in their intensity. In a crowded courtroom, Ana Clara's testimony was measured. Facts first, feelings later. She testified about the steering wheel, the sound of the rip, the slap. She described her mother's breath growing thin, and the way the officer's indifference had been not an accident, but a choice. The prosecutor asked the questions that made the jury listen. The defense attempted to reconstruct nuance into doubt, but the tape and photographs had made the most obstinate of doubts brittle.
After the verdicts, Helena held her daughters in a small embrace that felt like both gratitude and relief. Isabella, whose career had been put on the scales, did not find vindication in applause. She found it in the quiet knowledge that the law had worked as it was intended, to bind accountability to evidence and conscience. She had paid costs, quiet hours of review, and some colleagues' coolness, but her sense of duty had borne fruit. The costs were not only professional. At times she felt exhaustion that seeped into the bones. Long nights of paperwork, the emotional weight of watching a family near dying in an unlit cell, and the attention of the public had all left marks. She sometimes held the badge without ceremony and felt the history of what it represented, imperfect, necessary, and always bound to the fragile contract between people and those who serve them. A year later, small steps of reform took root in the precincts. A training series on detainee rights and medical protocols was implemented. Station intake logs were digitized with time-stamped entries. The governor's office allocated funds for improved emergency response in rural areas. None of those measures erased the harm done that night, but they reduced the likelihood of the same negligence occurring in the same form. Isabella visited the station one afternoon months later and observed a new intake kiosk with a clean terminal. A young officer who had been hired after the scandal approached her with attentive respect. "We read your report," he said. "We want to do it right."
She looked at him and felt the arc of what she had chosen to do. "Then keep the records," she said. "Keep them clean. Let the light fall where it must." The personal payoffs were modest. Isabella's name carried the weight of controversy and the soft sheen of integrity. She avoided grand speeches and instead kept showing up. Helena and Ana Clara made a ritual of gathering on Sunday afternoons, playing cards on a table scarred by years of meals. There was laughter again in the kitchen, uprival music at first, then fuller. There were also quiet moments of reckoning. Night came and sometimes brought with it the small doubt: had she risked too much? Had the system exacted a price worthy of the good achieved? She answered those questions in the way she always had, by continuing to do the work and by holding herself to the standards of her oath. The case itself became a reference point for other women and families who had been wronged. Letters came from other towns seeking advice. Young officers who believed in better policing reached out, asking how to navigate chains of command with moral clarity. Isabella answered with the same litany of precise actions she had used that night: document, preserve, seek medical care, secure witnesses. She taught them the small rituals that make justice more than an idea. In a closing scene that did not feel like an ending but like an accounting, Isabella stood once more on a small rise of land outside her mother's house. The sugarcane field waved in the wind, indifferent and generative in the same breath. She held her badge in her palm, turning it till the light caught the edge. The badge had not changed much, its metal was still the same, but the weight she felt now came from knowing what it could do when paired with insistence and care. Helena came up behind her and draped an arm around her shoulders. "You did good," she said simply. It was praise and a way to settle a reckoning in the body. "I did what I could," Isabella answered. "We did what we could." Ana Clara joined them and leaned into their small alignment. She had returned to her studies with a different steadiness. The law textbooks were no longer abstract, they were tools on a table. "I'm not done," she said, a simple promise to her mother and sister. "People need someone to put rules in reach." Isabella smiled at her sister, proud and wary and hopeful at once. "Then keep learning," she said, "and remember the rules. The law is a harness for the brave, not a replacement for courage." They three stood in the waning sun, a family held together by both fault and fidelity. The path had been dangerous and ugly and imperfect, but in a small, consequential way, it had altered the course of lives and the habits of institutions. The system had struck back, the colonel had mobilized, the station had been besieged by posture, Isabella had been questioned, but exposure and the steady practice of procedure had reframed outcome.
The arrests had been made within the law, the charges pursued. Helena had survived because medicine met neglect in time. Ana Clara was no longer merely a victim, but an advocate in training. Isabella had lost some quiet, gained some voice, and kept her integrity intact. Justice had not revealed itself as a miracle, it had shown up as paperwork, witnesses, oxygen, photographs, public light, and stubborn human choices. It had required risk, documentation, and a refusal to let dignity be dismissed. The result was not a healed institution, but a changed corridor in which reform could begin to gather purchase. If this story moved you, share it. Let the small acts of courage reach someone who needs to know they are not invisible.